Good morning. Again, I think as we did last time, let's keep everyone open and at any point raise a comment, question, and I think that probably is more helpful than accumulating them at the end when people forget what it was they wanted to ask. All right, so let me continue. First, a little recap of what we did last week. I talked about my meeting with an extraordinary individual. His name back in Poland was Naftali Salashutz. I knew him, obviously in this country, as Norman Saltitz. He was a survivor, but far more than that, he was a fighter, a hero, a chronicler of his life, gifted with an extraordinary memory and an ability to recall details, the likes of which I found totally astounding. Absolutely encyclopedic mind. Why is it of interest to you? It obviously was of interest to me because I'm a historian and I'm a sucker for anything having to do with the olden days. But for you, and the reason I thought it valuable to bring this to your attention is for a number of reasons. One, you can't help but think of the parallels with Anatevka. This is Anatevka writ large. Anatevka is set in Russia about 1903, 1905. The setting for this chronicle of his village essentially goes from about 1920 to 1941 after its capture by the Germans. And I think it's fair to say, and the reason I'm spending time presenting it to you, is that I think the story that I'm about to tell is representative of hundreds of, maybe even thousands of other little villages, Jewish villages in large part, throughout Eastern Europe, so that if you get a sense of what went on here, you have a pretty good idea of life in Eastern Europe, not in Warsaw, not in the large cities, but in these, what you might call Shtetl. And of course, it's a vanished world. It's a world that no longer is. Fragments of it, of course, are still around. If you go to Williamsburg, Brooklyn, if you go to Orange County, if you go to Israel. In fact, many of those communities, those that survived, ended up relocating in the United States. So if you go, as I say, to parts of Brooklyn, you will see fragments of what I'm about to talk to you about. So last week, if you remember, I devoted the entire conversation to religious matters because that, frankly, was the primary focus of their lives. Unlike us who tend to compartmentalize religion, you know, we do it at certain times and we probably don't think much about it at other times. Their lives were suffused by religion. They were devoted to God, to Torah, to prayer, to charity, to tradition. Their world was a world of shtibels, endless minions, going to the mikveh, starting to attend cheder at age 3, devoting themselves to serious study, venerating scholars, affiliating with rabbinical dynasties, the women keeping kosher to the nth degree, and of course, as we spoke last time, devoting a lot of time and energy to preparing for various holidays. So that was the religious world. What I'd like to do today is to, well, I have one leftover religious holiday that I want to talk to you about. But other than that, we're going to present various vignettes about life in this village. And hopefully before we're finished, you come away with a good sense of what it might have been like had you visited Kolbashova in the late 1920s and throughout the 1930s. I do want to start, because we never got to it last time, about what certain features of Passover in the village. They couldn't fly to Florida. They couldn't fly to Israel for Passover. They simply had to make preparations at home. And it was a cause of considerable anxiety, as it is for us. I mean, a lot goes on, a lot has to be prepared. And in many instances, it created a fair amount of hardship. Passover was a time that people did get together. From other villages, family gathered. After all, it was an 8-9 day affair. There was time to do this kind of visiting. And a lot of it did take place, particularly when a marriage was in the offing. Very often the potential son-in-law would spend some time with the bride or the potential bride and the family. Passover was the opportunity for that. Those who could afford it, and we'll talk about the social structure of Kol B'Shova, those who could afford it usually got new clothes. You rarely, I mean, the amount of clothes these people had was highly limited. If they were to get any new clothes at all, it came during Passover. And as Norman said, those who did get them would say something like, I have new from top to bottom. And the question, of course, was, you got your clothes from a tailor, and would the tailor have the clothes ready? Evidently, this was a source of considerable anxiety. Also, this was the primary opportunity to clean the house. And what you saw, or at least what Norman said you would see had you been there, is that in front of every house, virtually every piece of furniture was put out onto the street. And therefore a thorough cleaning of the house, and if necessary, and if you could afford it, this is when you painted your house. So you can imagine the sight, going down a street in Kol B'Shova and seeing everything out on the street while people took care of cleansing. I mean, the good news in a sense was these were hardly extensive apartments. So when you're talking about cleaning, you may have 1 or 2 rooms, at most 3, that were involved. It was a problem also for businessmen. The Jewish community pretty much ran probably virtually all of the businesses within the town, the retail and the wholesale. And this was a problem when it did tend to coincide with Easter, because how do you accommodate your Polish customers and also prepare for the Passover holiday? So it was a cause of great anxiety having to do both almost simultaneously. Of course, there was the chametz to sell. It was the chametz to collect around the house, new dishes to be brought up from the basement. You know all of that. What was interesting is this is a time when monies from America, remember I told you, and you all know about these benevolent societies of people who came from the old country, settled here, and kept in communication with the old country and with their village. And this is when they tended to send money back to, in this case, Kol B'Shova, in order to help people prepare for Passover, enable them to buy the food and make the other preparations. This was a source of considerable tension because there were always complaints that the committee in Kol B'Shova did not distribute the funds properly, that there was favoritism, people thought they should get more money than they did. You can imagine some of the dissension that might have taken place. Another feature of the Passover preparation, obviously, was matzah. And matzah was baked by bakers who kind of surfaced at this time, totally different facilities to bake the matzah. What I found fascinating was the fact that the matzah was used to give gifts to their Polish friends and associates. Kids would typically bring matzah into their teachers at school.
Never heard
I
of
find
that.
this interesting for a number of reasons, but particularly, of course, all of you know about the blood libel, the notion among anti-Semites and outsiders that the Jews mixed Christian blood into their matzah. And here we have matzahs being distributed as gifts to many elements of the Polish community. The father spent a lot of time making wine in the cellar, and the woman of the house spent weeks prior to this collecting schmaltz. And there's a funny story. The kids loved, I guess we still love, if we still permit ourselves to eat it, schmaltz on matzah is an absolutely scrumptious treat. And the funny story here is that you wanted to get the fattest goose that presumably had the greatest amount of schmaltz. And so that when the peasants came into town on market day, Norman and others went out before they got to the town, hung on to the wagon, grabbed on to what they considered the fattest goose there, and did not let go until the wagon entered the marketplace, and then laid claim to that goose. Meanwhile, the peasant is trying to use his whip to get these people off his wagon because it's hindering its approach to the town. But this notion of trying to get the fattest goose, which would yield the greatest quantity of schmaltz, I found rather laughable. We could, but I won't. It's rather involved how shmira matzah was prepared with great care, great consideration, great caution, special fields to grow the wheat. And then Norman spoke of what we might call ultra shmira matzah, where the ultra-Orthodox went to all sorts of lengths and prayers and special water to create their exclusive ultra-shmira matzah. Okay, so much for Passover. If you had entered Kol B'Shover, if you were on tour in the 1930s, you would probably find this town rather unexceptional. You might not even stop. You'd probably roll down the window and maybe point to one or two structures, but pass on. It was not notably distinctive. It was rather drab and in many ways rather backward. Although, as I was thinking about it today, if you looked at the United States in the 1930s, rural America was extraordinarily backward too. If you know anything about the New Deal, electrification in rural America did not come until the late 1930s. So in all fairness, what I tell you about Kol B'Shover, being a relatively rural village, is not all that different from rural areas in other parts of the world, including the United States. So it was a fairly sleepy village, except for that one day that I mentioned to you last time, Market Day, when thousands of people streamed into the market square, and it was a memorable day at many, many different levels. That was on a Tuesday. The most prominent feature of the town was the market square, which could, according to Norman's calculation, accommodate maybe 5,000 people on market day. There was a river, not very impressive, but centuries before, one of the local counts took a trip to Egypt, and he was so impressed with what he saw that he came back and named this river the Nile. So it was the Nile River flowing through Kol B'Shover, and a stretch of it was referred to as the Sahara. They bathed in it, they did a little fishing in it, they washed their clothes in it, but for the most part, it was rather understated when it comes to rivers. Here's what you'd find if you looked around, if you stopped for a few minutes and took a look. A prominent feature of the marketplace was the well. And that was the primary source of water for the entire village. There were some secondary wells, but mostly it was the well. And Louise remembers when we did visit Kolbashova, one of the few features that I actually recognized and remembered was this well in the middle of the marketplace. So that meant that every day you had to go out with your bucket, or any other day, wait online, draw water from the well, unless you were pretty well-to-do, in which case you would hire water carriers who would go to the well for you and then deliver the water. No bathrooms, no indoor plumbing. The big news that happened in Kolbashova occurred in 1938 when Dr. Leon Anderman installed indoor plumbing and had the first toilet. Other than that, you know what the alternative was. The alternative was outhouses. If you didn't want to go to the outhouse at night, and who did, you then used a pot, and then you had to empty the pot in the morning. Talk about emptying the outhouses. Once or twice a year, the peasants would come into town and clean the outhouses out for the residents there, and then spread the organic matter on their fields, so everyone benefited. You got rid of the organic matter, and the peasants had the fertilizer to make their fields a bit more productive. There were 3 outdoor lamps in Kolbashova, 3. And this was a major event every day. The kids would follow the policeman. He would take a string and the kerosene lamp would come down. He'd fill it with kerosene. He'd go from one lamp to another. There was a total of 3. And that was the range of illumination in Kolbashova. The light usually went out by about midnight or 1 o'clock, and then it was totally dark in the village. Flashlights did not appear until the late 1930s. There were 3 or 4 radios in town, crystal sets. Some of you may know about crystal sets. By and large, as Norman commented, just when you wanted to hear news, they started to crackle and the reception failed, and therefore they were totally unreliable. There were 6 telephones in Kolbashova, 3 in private hands and 3 in governmental offices. Connections were difficult, it was costly, and therefore it was very rare that anyone made telephone calls or received them. There were 2 cameras in Kolbashova. Norman, as I told you last week, got a camera, a Brownie from America, and then there was a photographer who would set up in the marketplace and take formal portraits of people as they came by. What was very big in Kolbashova in the 1930s was the onset of bicycles. Every young person wanted a bicycle. I'm not sure exactly why. In fact, Rabbi Shtetl talked about bicycles and whether they were kosher or not, but evidently they weren't from the point of view, and I'm not sure why the Orthodox frowned upon them, but Norman learned to ride a bike, but he was kicked out of Talmud Torah for a period of time because he was caught riding a bike. Perhaps on Saturday, perhaps there was some other infraction, but in any event, bikes were very big. You know, you were a proud possessor of a bike. There was 1 car in town. In the mid-1930s, someone bought a battered used car, and of course, it was the showpiece of the entire town. Everyone either walked, took about 20 minutes to walk the full extent of the town, or if they didn't walk, wagons were omnipresent. Everyone drove a wagon around town or to a neighboring town. In 1937, Kolbashova saw its first airplane land. There was a kid in town who joined the Polish Air Force. Somehow he took his plane and landed it near the Catholic cemetery in 1937. You can imagine the excitement it caused. Everyone came to watch him take off on a Sunday night. No one believed the plane would take off. And of course, when it did, they all cheered. And that was the one and only time before the Germans arrived that an airplane landed in the village. There were 2 bus trips a day to a nearby village of about 16 miles away. And of course, everyone waited anxiously for the bus to come. It would bring the mail, it would bring visitors. So if you saw pictures of Kolbashova as the bus comes into the square, kids were following it, everyone was following to see what was new, what was happening. But of course, the big deal in Kolbashova was the arrival of the mail every day. The postman being followed around by townsmen, not waiting for him to deliver the mail, but wanting to know, do I have a letter? Do I have a letter? Do I have a package? This connection to the outside being so critical. Okay, so much for the physical layout of Kolbashova. Stucco, drab, a few large buildings, the church, the town hall, the municipal building. It was, after all, a county seat of sorts, so it wasn't totally limited to 1 and 2 stories. Next subject, women in Kolbashova. What did Norman have to say about that? We mentioned last time the fact that women were limited in their religious obligations. Unmarried women did not have to go to synagogue. Married women had to go on Shabbos and sit upstairs, and also on the high holidays. But the religious obligations of women were, I would say, you pretty much had to get married at around age 17. You had to cut off your hair. You had to attend a mikveh on a regular basis. But the onerous demands of religion were relieved for women because they had so much more to do. And that, of course, meant maintaining the home. Well, what did maintaining the home mean? Well, you had to take care of the children. It was expected that you would have anywhere from 5 to 10 children. Norman's family featured 9 kids, all of whom survived. I wrote another book about another survivor in Poland years ago. His family was also 9. So if you were a woman, an Orthodox woman, it was expected that you probably would bear anywhere from 5 to 10 children. And evidently that was pretty much the norm. You lived in very cramped quarters. Very often the apartment was also a shop. That is, you had a shop in the front, you lived in the back, the 2 intermingled, and you can well imagine how cramped the circumstances were. Keeping kosher, of course, was paramount for women. And last week we spoke about when there were questions, dilemmas, the women ran to the rabbi to get an advisory opinion on how to keep kosher or how kosher might have been violated and what they might do about it. Norman has some very telling comments to make about his view of the plight or the role of women, and I'd like to give you a sense of what he had to say. It is hard not to conclude that the burdens placed on women exceeded those borne by the men of our community. For women, there was no relief from the multitude of tasks they were expected to perform. Whereas the men could head to the synagogue, attend study groups, join organizations, or go off to see their rabbis, the women were largely confined to their crowded homes. Certainly, the women complained more about their situation, and compared to the men, seemed more unhappy and depressed. And one final note from Norman about women as he saw them. I cannot help but think that the women of Kolbashova had far more difficult lives than the men. The difference was most obvious in their appearance. By age 40 to 45 or so, many looked old, fragile, much of their vitality gone. Each Friday night at home, after coming from the synagogue, we sang Ashes Chayil. We praised women's goodness, devotion, beauty, and valor. I think we understood the significance of our words, the need to pay tribute to those who sacrificed probably more than men could ever know. So I think Norman was rather sensitive on this issue, and I think you understand what he's saying. All right, let's turn to another subject related to this, namely marriage. Everyone got married. There was the rare exception, but boys at age 18 or so started dressing up. Their mothers dressed them to prepare to go courting, although that's hardly the term for it. And girls at age 17 were pretty well expected to be married. Matchmakers played a prominent role in this process. In fact, almost an exclusive role. Men and women, although we'll talk about this, didn't go off by themselves and look for partners. It had to be done through matchmakers who had networks of other matchmakers in neighboring villages to try to arrange a gathering. And of course, matchmakers, as always, had much superlative to say. Everyone was a prize pick. Everyone was suitable. The matchmaker got a percentage of the dowry, so the matchmakers went out of their way to be a little more aggressive when it came to the well-to-do people. The dowry was a critical factor in how this process proceeded. Assuming you could follow up and actually deliver the dowry that you promised. There were many stories circulating in Kol B'Shover about a dowry promised, and when it came time to pay and they counted out the money, there was insufficiency and there was all sorts of controversy, often having to be settled by the rabbi. In the case of Norman's father, he had 5 daughters, and he put away $2,000 for each of them, which was considered a princely sum. Norman's father ran a wholesale house and was rather among the well-to-do in the town. He would bury the money in a satchel in the basement. And of course, when it came time to deliver for a dowry, he would go down there and fetch out the $2,000, what gave him even greater leverage if at least a portion of the money was in American currency. American currency was much prized within Kol B'Shover. Getting married and getting the right partner and competing with other families for the same men or girls, whatever the case might be, was very competitive. And we have an interesting phenomenon, which I had never heard about, maybe you have, but evidently when matches were rumored, there would be an opportunity for others who got wind of it to voice objections to the upcoming marriage. And this was institutionalized. It was a Polish word called paskavils, in which those who got wind of it and those who had their own kids to marry off would write a letter to one of the parties where the marriage might be taking place to raise objections as to why that marriage should not take place. And Norman detailed one of those incidents where one of his sisters was making preparations to marry this young man, and the young man's father received one of these paskavils in which an anonymous writer wrote of the objections that he had that this marriage should not take place. Now, what did he say? I mean, what could you say about Norman's father, who was an upstanding member of the community, that would put a kibosh on the marriage? A number. It was a 6-page letter, by the way. and some of these are rather esoteric. He was, during World War I rationing, put in charge of the allocation of sugar. He was referred to as the sugar king in town, and the letter charged that he dealt unfairly with people, that there were black market operations, and that as sugar king, he violated the norms of the community. Well, that you can understand. But more than that, it was objected to the fact that he went to a dentist. By and large, people in Kolbashova, particularly the women, never went to dentists. Norman comments on the fact that most everyone after a certain age had few, if any, teeth left in their mouth. On the other hand, Norman did go to a dentist. Now, what was the problem with the dentist? The problem with the dentist was that she was a woman. And therefore, the Orthodox in town said, you can't go to a woman dentist because she's going to get too close to you. She's going to touch you. It's a violation, and you dare not attend a woman dentist. Well, he did, and that was held against him as part of this letter. In addition to which, the letter objected to the fact that it was known, well known, that on Shabbos, on Friday night, when the family got together, they sang, and the women sang with the men. Again, this was a violation. Women should not be singing with men. We understand that in your household, the women do, and therefore this marriage should not go forth. And then finally, I'm summarizing because there were many objections. Finally, the objection featured on the fact that one of Norman's family members, a woman, went to America on her own. And the notion of woman, I mean, America was suspect for a number of reasons, which I'll talk to you about later, but the idea of a woman traveling alone, let alone to America, was unacceptable. So Norman's father was beside himself. Who wrote this letter? He went to his rabbi, and the rabbi was rather indecisive. What will be, the rabbi said. He then went to a psychic in the area. Psychic, read this letter. Who do you think wrote it? And the psychic evidently had some pretty good ideas as to who it might be. There was someone in town who had two daughters, neither of which were married. And the psychic said that that letter probably came from these girls' father. In any event, the letter was received, the match went forward, but I did want to illustrate this institution of objecting to marriages with lengthy letters, some of which, for example, there were letters that spoke of business failures. You should know that this father has failed in business, is in debt. Maybe the marriage should not go forth. You should know that there's illness in the family, and maybe you should think twice about marrying into it. Why people felt obligated to tattle on others is a bit mysterious, but it was a community, and there were no secrets in Kolbashova. Everyone's business was everyone else's business. Okay, so the subject is marriage. The primary feature was the engagement party. And in many instances, the couple would be meeting for the first time at the engagement party. But there was a problem. Very often it wasn't clear who was responsible for the match. A number of matchmakers claimed that they were involved, claimed that they were responsible. And Norman points out that at many engagement parties, two matchmakers would show up demanding to be paid a percentage of the dowry. This was embarrassing, and therefore to avoid controversy and blowing up the party, you often had to pay one of the objecting managers. You had to buy him off to get him to get out of there so that the engagement party could go on. What else happened at the engagement party? The date was set for the wedding. It was usually a year from the engagement party, and they had to figure out you could not a woman could not marry 7 days before her menstrual period and 7 days after. So they had to do very close calculations. When was this woman likely to have her period based on past experience, and therefore figure out when this wedding could take place, usually on a Sunday, always in the town of the bride. Then there was an exchange of gifts. Well-to-do grooms were expecting a Swiss watch, which they usually got. And of course, the bride-to-be was expecting a ring. And of course, everyone said how bright the ring was, how incredibly large. And there was considerable talk about that. And then the critical part of the engagement party was the counting out meticulously, bill by bill, of the dowry. And God knows if it fell short, you had yourselves a problem. Once it was counted out, once the agreed upon sum was made, there'd be a shaking of the hands, and then for reasons I'm not entirely sure, all the women had plates, and they would smash the plates onto the floor, concluding the marriage ceremony. Moving on to the wedding. The wedding, as I say, was usually on a Sunday in the bride's village. And if you could afford it, what you would do is you would meet the wedding party at the train station in a carriage or in a covered wagon, and you would drive into town triumphantly, and the people of town stood on the street watching the wedding party arrive. Invitations were given out. No one sent invitations. A member of the synagogue went from house to house, orally, verbally inviting the people who were invited to the wedding. The wedding, you've been to Orthodox weddings, you know about Orthodox weddings. There was nothing that would surprise you about this. Two of the interesting features were, and this of course you're probably familiar with, a wedding to be successful, you needed what they called a batchen. A batchen, you probably would refer to them as a master of ceremonies, a comedian, an entertainer. If you got Tuvia from Tarnow, you could be assured that it would be a successful wedding. If you got Weintraub, you knew it was going to be a successful wedding. Batchens kept things lively. As the gifts were given out, he'd make funny comments. He was the life of the party. And by the time the Batchen took over, and this is very interesting, the rest of the village was invited in to the wedding. So it became a village affair, a festive affair, with the dancing of the men by themselves, the handkerchief with the bride and groom. You've seen scenes comparable to that. And now for the first time, really, the bride and groom would be by themselves. A room was given to them in the bride's house where they could be together for the first time. They had been tutored in sex by the parents on either side, telling them what to expect, what to do. You know, hopefully they were able to do it successfully. Norman speaks, and you know about this. A married couple slept in separate beds on each side of the room. Norman comments, over the years when he went and visited certain people, the beds began to become closer. A night table separated them. And then by the late 1930s, Norman was scandalized because he went into a house and saw the beds together, no longer separate. Final comment on this was how the town or the residents adapted to change. A lot of the women and a lot of the men began to get uneasy as modern ideas filtered into town that matchmakers should arrange their weddings. You remember that classic song from Fiddler, do you love me? Do you love me? Why did that couple ask that? Because they had an arranged marriage where love was not a factor. And after a while, the notion was you came to love each other. And I think Tevye wanted to know if his wife actually loved him. And she acknowledged that she did. But who knows how representative that might have been. In any event, the point I want to make here is that the young people grew restive under this regime of matchmakers, and the matchmakers had to adopt if they wanted to keep the business. So how did they adopt? They adopted by permitting or allowing or encouraging potential couples to get together prior to the possibility of a wedding. There was a Yiddish word for it called looking over, in which the matchmaker would arrange a meeting in a neutral town where none of them knew the parties involved, and they would get together and meet each other and decide as to compatibility. And these looking over sessions occurred several times before a match was declared. Norman speaks of one of his sisters who went on several of these get-togethers and, again, never heard from the boy again. But, that's what happened. But what it did was to give the matchmaker a role to play, arranging these get-togethers when the young people were restive and not wanting to have their lives determined by the matchmakers. Okay, moving on. Any thoughts or any comments about the wedding and the engagement that occurred to you that you might want to raise?
Richard, often after the couple was together, the parents would check to see whether there was blood on the sheet to see if it actually happened.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. The Norman speaks of examination of the sheets the next day. Yeah, I didn't know how much to credit that, but now that Holly has confirmed it, I suspect that that often occurred.
Yes, yeah.
Occurred. I want to speak to you about the poor of Kol B'Shova. The poor occupy a special place in my heart because years ago, and some of you old-timers may or may not remember, Central Synagogue put on a series of shows in which all the members participated. It started with South Pacific back in the early 70s, and a flower drum song in which I was the romantic lead in the, if you can believe that, in the flower drum song. And Don't Drink the Water by Woody Allen. And we did Tevye and Fiddler and Rabbi Littman. You may remember the name Rabbi Littman, who was a wonderful performer, musician, and singer. Rabbi Littman played the role of Tevye, and it was a very, very well done performance. In any event, I played a distinctly minor role in Fiddler. I was Nuchem the beggar. And you remember that line, Nuchem goes up to one of the well-to-do in town who gives him very little, only 2 kopecks. I had a bad week, he said. Well, if you had a bad week, why should I suffer? Very funny, but very insightful, because what it implied was that there was an obligation by well-to-do, despite their temporary circumstance, there was an obligation of the well-to-do to aid the poor. Why should I suffer if you happen to have a bad week? You owe me whatever the normal charity donation was. Again, I never know, and fortunately, well, most of us never really know how it is that the poor manage to survive. In every society, in our society, particularly now? How do the poor do it? And what are our attitudes toward the poor? Norman has some very interesting insights into the poor of Kolbashova. I should give you what Norman says is the social stratification of the town. According to him, there were 10% of the population. Again, there were, to repeat, about 2,000 Jews and about 2,000 Poles in this particular town. Of the Jews, or maybe of the Jews and the Poles, I'm not really sure what he meant, he estimates that about 10% were pretty comfortable, pretty well off, able to afford a decent life. 40% of the population, scrimped and saved, but could make it. But 50%, about half the population of Kolbashova, was poor, who lived hand to mouth, who lived on the edge, who were marginal, had to depend, as you'll see, on all sorts of charities. So this was considered a poor town. But I found very moving and very insightful when Norman comes to comment on the role and plight of the poor in Kolbashova. Let me first read you a passage. How all these people got along, I never really understood, especially when most had to support large families. But they made do with very, very little. The barest of living quarters, one set of patched clothes, the most basic of foods, supplemented by frequent acts of kindness and charity from fellow Jews. Distributions of potatoes and firewood, food supplies for the holidays, money and clothes sent by relatives overseas, such gifts could make the difference, avert catastrophe. Yet, however unfortunate the poor might be, most were not tragic figures. Many were warm, friendly, dare I say, contented. People who expected little from life, but were content to be alive, to have families, and to find comfort in their God and in their religious obligations. Not blaming the world or cursing their fate was dignity in their endurance. And further along, being poor is never easy. And certainly the poor of Kolbashova suffered. Still, it was not in anger or with constant complaints that most lived their lives. You could be poor, but what did you need? A roof over your head, some clothes, bread, potatoes, soup. Most managed that much of the time. Besides, Kolbashova was a poor town. To be poor in a poor town was no great shame. No one singled you out or thought it necessary to account for your condition. It needed no explanation. Anyway, God owed no one a living. On the other hand, together with God, you could live as a person should. The humblest person who walked with God, walked with dignity, was respected. Very interesting. And finally, on the obligation to give charity as Norman viewed it. With us, charity was not an afterthought or a matter of minor importance. It stood at the very center of our religious beliefs, an obligation of the highest order. Men of standing in the community had to give, and give in many ways. Not only directly to the needy who came knocking on their doors regularly, I would estimate that in a given week we had 10 such requests, but also to the many charitable organizations in town. Giving anonymously was considered a most elevated deed, but naturally, many preferred their generosity to be public knowledge. There were beggar families I mean, that's what they were. These were the beggars in town, and they would come on a regular basis to those they knew were comfortable and would beg and would be given food, a little money, some used clothes, etc. For example, to Norman's house, there was this woman, Golda, who came every week on a Saturday afternoon. She would be given soup, she'd be given challah, a piece of meat, some tea, a piece of cake, and in about 10, 15 minutes, she'd finish her meal and she would leave. And next week on Saturday, about the same time, Golda would show up and Golda would be given a meal. What I found most compelling is the following institution. Beggars would come from outside Kol B'Shova, Jewish beggars, and they'd come to the synagogue on Friday night, and they'd wait after the service to be invited to go to someone's house for the Shabbos meal. And for a while, that's the way it was. But then some of the Jews in the synagogue said, this is unseemly. This is putting these people in an awkward position. Let's form a committee who will then designate which people will invite who to their houses on a regular basis, so that these beggars won't stand around waiting to be asked and in an embarrassing position. So the institution was established that these beggars would, at the end of the Shabbos service, know exactly who had committed to taking them home. And as Norman says, there was virtually no Shabbos night for months on end where a beggar from the synagogue was not taken home and given a meal. I found that very, very uplifting. There was another aspect to this. Many of the businessmen, quote unquote, Jewish businessmen, were marginal characters in terms of business, working small margins, trading goods, buying from one, selling to another, buying from a peasant, bringing it into town. They had no money to buy stock, to buy goods, and therefore the well-to-do gave out loans on a regular basis to these people so that they could buy some goods in order to sell them. And Norman's father was one of those who constantly was making weekly loans to these marginal businessmen in order for them to buy stock goods and enable to sell them. And then there was a fellow in town by the name of Kvitch Leisner, who himself was poor, but he borrowed money from Norman's father in order to lend it out to the others so that they could buy their goods and have something to sell. So he himself was poor, but he borrowed money in order to lend it to those who needed it. Then there were the Jewish estate managers out in the countryside who brought in wood, who brought in food, who brought in chicken to help the poor. So I think I had to conclude from what Norman told me, and I think you can get this from the little I told you, that the Jews of this town and probably of many other towns were caring, were compassionate, felt obligated to support, and there was a deep sense of continuity. This whole story was very moving to me and very uplifting. Next topic, Palestine. What was the role of Palestine in this village? Of course, I need hardly remind you of the role of Eretz Yisrael, of Israel in the Jewish tradition. It, of course, is central. Virtually every house in Kol B'Shova had a pishka, the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, so that they knew you could give money that would go to support an institution or the migration of Jews to Palestine. What I found interesting, the well-to-do, when they painted the main room of their house, would leave a little square unpainted on the eastern wall of their house and would write in that square, in remembrance of the destruction of the temple. A square unpainted to remind them, of course, of that disastrous event. Now, a wave of enthusiasm swept through Kol B'Shova. Zionism became a big deal in the late 20s and 30s, but it was not for the Orthodox, and therefore there were a fair number of objections to it. The Orthodox worried about Palestine. Why? One, many of them said, forget about Palestine until the Messiah comes. Without a Messiah, no Palestine. Others said, from what we're hearing in Palestine, those who are coming back and telling us stories, it's too modern. Some of the Jewish traditions are not being adhered to. Men and women are gathering together, unacceptable. So they had those kinds of objections to the Palestine wave of enthusiasm. And the socialists who were growing in strength in Eastern Europe also felt, you don't go to Palestine, you build socialism in your own country, you alleviate the plight and the condition of the people, you don't go run off and take the pressure off. So socialists and the ultra-Orthodox had exceptions to this wave of Zionist enthusiasm. But of course, for many of the others, particularly for the young, the wave of enthusiasm for Palestine grew as the 1930s wore on. Norman had prepared to go at the last minute. Things fell through, but a lot of young people had this in mind. And what they did is throughout Eastern Europe and on the outskirts of Kol B'Shova, the Zionists created camps in which those young people and others who intended to go to Palestine were trained and prepared for what they would encounter. In what way? They were taught farming, because clearly the Jewish settlement was mostly involved in farming. They were taught the Hebrew language. They were taught Hebrew songs, so that there was a kind of cultural and economic preparation for Israel, for Palestine at that time, in these various camps that were established throughout Eastern Europe. The Poles, well, how did the Poles view it? On one hand, and you know this before, the Jews don't want to stay here and help us. The Jews want to run off to Palestine. That old bugaboo about divided loyalty. They're not good Poles. They would rather desert us, abandon us, and go to Palestine. On the other hand, good riddance. Who needs them? One of the curses you heard Poles frequently say, go to Palestine, Jews. Take the pressure off us. Good riddance. Goodbye. So there was that attitude on the part of fellow Poles. Interestingly, the British throughout the 1930s did permit certain Jews to migrate to Palestine. They established a certificate program whereby they issued limited number of certificates for people to go, and a few in Kol B'Shova got the certificates until the Jews realized that one certificate could actually cover someone else who you got married to. So what happened was that there was a wave of bogus marriages that took place in Kol B'Shova, whereby people got married, showed the marriage certificate to British authorities, were able to go, and of course, once they landed in Palestine, the marriage was terminated, and this way you could use one certificate to get two Jews into Palestine. One of Norman's brothers did marry with a certificate and was able to take this woman with him into Palestine. Going to Palestine was a big deal in town. One day in 1933, 3 young men were leaving for Palestine. It became the source of great entertainment, enthusiasm. The whole Jewish population turned out. The Jewish band, the Hazamia, played. People sang as they escorted these three young men to the bus that would take them to the railroad that would take them off on their journey to Palestine. So going to Palestine, yes, it was a loss, but on the other hand, it was fulfillment of an obligation, it was a way of getting out of Kol B'Shova, and it was a cause of great celebration in the town. So you can imagine the town gathering, the band playing, escorting these esteemed young men to the station, waving goodbye, and fulfilling this obligation to return to the land of Israel. And those who went to Israel, it was said, were changed people. They were no longer the Jews that we knew from the Shtetl. And there's one very interesting incident. Norman's brother David went to Israel, and we have that stereotypical picture of David as a pioneer wielding an axe with his son behind him. You've seen a million of these kind of pictures fitting the notion of what the, what do we call them? The Jews who went to Israel, the... yeah, these early pioneers. And it was,
Chalutzim.
okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So when they came back, you can imagine, this would be true of America too, which I'll talk about. When they came back, they were the center of attention. What's it like? What are you doing? Can we go? For weeks on end, you know, people came to the household where they were and questioned them. It was kind of an open forum. But it was said that they were different. They were self-assertive. They were independent. They looked differently. And then one day, when David came back, there was an incident in Kol B'Shova that proved it. There was a draft day once a year when the peasant boys came into town to sign up for the draft, and they were raucous and they were loud, and they tended to beat up Jews when they saw them. And so in this one instance, these peasant boys went into the barbershop and started breaking up the place. And Norman's brother David was standing outside, and one of the Jews, as was typical, was being beaten up in the barbershop. And David went in, picked up a chair, and started smashing the poles to get them to stop this aggression. And he beat up several of them. He was a rather strong young man. And needless to say, word went throughout town that a Jew had risen up, was aggressive, fought back, when Jews typically didn't. And it was said that, of course, the explanation was he went to Israel and he was a new person. And that kind of reinforced the notion of what Israel would do for the Jewish people. And later on, we can't get into this, but later on after the war, Norman found himself as a high-ranking officer in the Polish army. And what he was involved with was smuggling arms into Israel, helping Zionist groups smuggle displaced persons into Israel. He himself wanted to go to Israel, but his wife said, I'm sure the British are going to catch us. They'll put us in prison in Cyprus, and we'll never get to Israel. So she talked him out of going to Israel. But when he later went to the United States, he was a major supporter of Israel and gave very generously to various Israel causes. Next to last topic is America. What role did America play in Kol B'Shova? And as I mentioned last time, there had been a constant flow of residents from Kol B'Shova to the United States, particularly to New York City, especially to the Lower East Side, since the 1890s. They had formed these benevolent organizations. Norman's father had many family members who had gone to America. I did mention part of Norman's family was George Burns, who moved. Well, his family moved. They settled on the Lower East Side. George Burns was Nathan Birnbaum when he arrived in America. But there was that kind of connection. Again, here the Orthodox are rather ambivalent about America. America is a place where you'll lose your religion. In fact, in Norman's collection of pictures, there is a picture of one of his relatives standing in front of a kosher butcher, trying to prove that in America, you could still be kosher. You could still be kosher. But no one believed that. In America, you lost your Jewishness or part of it. When visitors from America came back, their payas either had disappeared or were shorter. Their hair was cut shorter. They did not wear the black coats. And worst of all, they smoked. They smoked. Here is a typical story that Norman relates about what the people of Kolbashova said happened to you if you went to America. A young man arriving from America to visit his mother is asked how well he is maintaining his religious obligations. Are you, my son, saying your morning prayers? One must work very hard in America, he replies. There is no time for such things. Are you still attending the synagogue on Saturday? Mother, in America, there's so much to do. Keeping the Sabbath is very inconvenient. Well, I certainly expect that you'll be keeping kosher. I try, but it's just not possible in America. Well, the mother replies in obvious exasperation, tell me, my son, are you still circumcised? Again, you get the tenor of the remarks. But to have someone in America made you a someone in Kolbashova. And why is that? Because gifts would come, money would come, packages would come, clothes would come. If you needed to escape, you had the opportunity to go to America. So it's fascinating. Having a connection to America was a big deal in Kolbashova. And they did see, there was a movie theater in town that opened Saturday and Sunday nights. And you could see, Norman remembers going to see Nelson Eddy and Jeanette MacDonald. They also followed American sports. Well, actually only one sport. In Kolbashova, they liked American boxing. Why did they like American boxing? Because as many of you know, for a period of time, Jewish fighters were rather prominent in the boxing field in various weight categories. There was Benny Leonard, there was Maxie Rosenblum, there was Barney Ross. So there was a connection to boxing, and that helped cement the relationship of Kolbashova to the United States. Interesting story. Because many anticipated going to the United States, there was an interest in learning English. And there was a young man in town who was totally given over. I want to go to America. I'm going to America. I'm learning America. That was Kalman Karenweiss. Kalman Karenweiss by name. Everyone called him Charlie because they thought that was the typical American name. So Kalman Karenweiss became the tutor of Norman and a number of other young people. And Norman learned pretty well how to speak English while in Kolbashova. But Charlie was such an enthusiast for America that he wrote a letter to Eleanor Roosevelt in the 1930s. And the end of the story is that Eleanor Roosevelt wrote back. he got a letter from Eleanor Roosevelt in 1934 or 35, and you can imagine how he prized that letter. Eleanor Roosevelt wrote to me. Unfortunately, Kalman never made it out of Kolbashova. Packages from America, you can imagine the excitement. One of the reasons for the excitement is you knew they were coming. You'd get a letter. It took about a month for a letter to come from America to Kolbashova, and about 2 months for a package to come from America to Kolbashova. So you knew about a month in advance that a package would be coming. So you'd go down to the post office, you'd harass the postman, package, and of course one day there'd be a package, and the package inevitably contained clothes. And that was a big deal because the clothes were modern. The clothes were, while not new, certainly seemed new in this backwater town of Kolbashova. But sometimes they were too new. Sometimes they were too revealing. Sometimes the women's blouses were too short and could not be worn. So part of the problem with receiving clothes from America is often you had to alter them to make them acceptable. But nonetheless, they were prized possessions, clothes from America. And the most sterling item, the most sought after item of clothes from America was, can you guess? It would be hard to guess really, but the answer is shoes. Shoes from America for a number of reasons. People had one, maybe 2 pair of shoes, one for the holiday, one for every other time of the day, any other time of the year. And of course, these shoes were constantly repaired. And of course, all the shoes were black. All the shoes were black. From America, however, you could get shoes of different colors, of gray, of brown, etc. So shoes were a prized possession from America. Equally as prized, and one might say, was visits from America. My God, can you imagine the visits, the family, what's it like? Very much similar to the Palestine story. Often, as some of you know, if you know the history of immigration, often the men went first, and there'd be years before the men came back. They had to accumulate some money. Life was hard. They often couldn't send for their families. Therefore, the family would be left waiting, hoping for letters, which didn't always come. And then there's the saddest of stories, men going off to America from Kolbashova, leaving their families, and never coming back, having their heads turned, maybe meeting another woman in America, and simply cutting themselves off from the family. Letters would be written to Kolbashova, to the Benevolent Society in New York. Can you please trace this man? We haven't heard from him. His wife and family are waiting. They're anguished, they're distressed. Track him down, convince him to return. In the pages of the Forvitz, there were classified ads. Does anyone know my husband, Moshe? He arrived 2 years earlier. He's described this way. Do you remember, Louise, when we looked in one of the, we saw letters, a collection of letters of this sort, of letters from the old country trying to track down men who had, I can't tell you what the numbers were, but it did happen, and you can imagine the distress that created. And there were people who returned to Kolbashova. Older men returned to find a younger wife. Other families returned because they found life too hard. Others returned because a relative had died and had a business to pass on. And then there was this curious character that Norman spoke to me about named Zvi Einhorn. What Einhorn did was extraordinary. He came to America periodically, stayed a few years, and then returned to Kolbashova. What he would do is he would go down to the Lower East Side on Delancey Street, and he had a way of contorting his foot, so he tied it up so it looked like he only had one foot. And then he would go around begging on Delancey Street and collect a fair amount of money. Once he had enough money, he'd return to Kolbashova. Naturally, he had 2 feet. And then a year or 2 later, he would repeat the performance, tie his foot up, go to the Delancey Street, and start collecting as a beggar again. So we have a variety of circumstances relating to the connection between America, extraordinary, and to Kolbashova. Final topic, the relationship of Poles and Jews in the town. I mean, all of you know the horrific story over the centuries of Jews with pogroms, expulsions, inquisitions. But what the story I'm about to tell you is quite instructive because it reveals what it's like for Jews to live in a community, in a place, in a nation, where you're at best tolerated, where there's always cause for apprehension and insecurity. We call these good times when we weren't violated, when we weren't attacked, when there were not pogroms, but all the other times were fraught with insecurity. And, if you think about the United States, unfortunately, if you even think about it now, many of the early years of Jews in America were just under those circumstances with lots of discrimination, physical attacks, etc. So what I'm going to talk to you about life in Kolbashova, I think, is representative of what life for Jews was like virtually throughout their history, except for the worst parts when they were attacked, driven out, expelled, etc. Officially, life was not bad. If you looked at the seal, which was posted on the town hall, the seal of Kolbashova was instructive. It had a handshake. Clearly, the handshake was of a Jew and a Pole. And they had a Jewish star and a Polish eagle. So at least officially, formally, the seal of Kolbashova suggested a level of acceptance, mutuality, brotherhood, however you want to describe it. On the municipal council of Kolbashova, equal number of Jews, equal number of Poles. However, the mayor was always a Pole. The deputy mayor was a Jew. When it came to celebrating the national holidays, of which there were several, Jews and Poles did gather together, did march, did sing, etc., etc. They went to school together. Almost every peasant had his Jewish shopkeeper who he trusted, who he did business with. There was a mutual economic interdependence. The peasants had to sell their goods to the Jewish shopkeepers and in turn pick up what they needed from the Jewish shopkeepers, whether it be salt, whether it be kerosene, whether it be seeds, whether it be candles, etc. In Kolbashova, you had to close on Sunday. Sunday was the Sabbath for the Catholics. Jews did not want to close on Sunday because they had already closed on Saturday. So an accommodation was reached. The Jews had to close the front door, but the Jews could open the back door. So if you wanted to shop on Sunday in a Jewish shop, you go in the back door. So my point here is that there was a level of accommodation the seal, the municipal council. So you could say outwardly, it seemed like things were okay. But consider the following. There was a pogrom in Kolbashova in 1919. The peasants flocked into the town, killed 9 Jews, injured 200. So memories of the pogrom of 1919 obviously lingered for many years to come. There was almost complete social separation. In Kolbashova, a Catholic was a Pole first. In Kolbashova, a Jew was always a Jew and never a Pole. Violence, or the threat of violence, was just below the surface. I've already told you about the draft day when the peasants came into town, often broke the windows of Jewish shops, beat up Jews on occasion. Polish kids pulled the hair of Jewish girls. Jewish wagons going out of town were occasionally turned over. The Jews felt it politic to get off the sidewalk when Poles were walking down the sidewalk. There was a Jewish soccer team, and when they played the Polish soccer team in town, things were very rough, and in the stands, things were even rougher. And the point is, as I said, the Jews never fought back. There were a few instances, there were more than I told you, when David fought back in the barbershop, but by and large, the Jews had to accept the situation. The Poles got all the jobs in the government. There were 2 government jobs that the Jews got. One was the postman, because he had fought in World War II and was a decorated soldier. This Jewish man got a Jewish position, and another one fought in Pilsudski's army that kept the Russians out in 1919. So yeah, there were 2 exceptions, but everyone else, every municipal official was Polish, no Jews, no Jews. And another cause of concern, the Jews closed their shops on Jewish holidays, but often the Polish peasants couldn't keep track of which the Jewish holidays were, and obviously they didn't get word, and therefore they'd come into town to buy stuff from Jewish merchants and discover the merchants were closed for the holiday. Well, okay, you can understand it, but it was often a cause of resentment. I came into town, I brought my goods, and you're closed, you know, dirty Jew, dirty Jew. And then there were some outright anti-Semites who staged, well, these 2 heart-rending descriptions, I think, will speak for the whole story. There was a 2nd or 3rd grade teacher by the name of Wisniewski, who didn't like the Orthodox Jews in his class and determined one day he was going to cut off their Pious. So he put on gloves, he took a big scissor, and he began systematically to go up to the Jewish kids and cut their Pious. This created mayhem. The kids were screaming. Norman happened to be in this class. And he had a teacher, another teacher called DeLonga, who was this big, burly woman, stand at the door to prevent these young kids from leaving. Well, Norman rushed past her and ran to his father's house or his business. Tata, Tata, Mishnat Pious. Tata, Mishnat Pious, which of course means, Daddy, they're cutting our Pious. Here's how Norman describes the aftermath. My father, hearing the commotion, came running out of his store and joined by Mr. Greenstein, the director of the Jewish bank, hurried to the school. There he found some 50 wailing children, each missing one of his pious. My father immediately summoned the principal and the police, and later a photographer. He would not let the matter rest. Word of the incident spread quickly, and over the next few days, pictures of the crying children with their missing pious appeared on the front pages of newspapers across Poland. Wisniewski was suspended and the matter taken to court. My father's friends, however, urged him to withdraw the charges, which they insisted would unnecessarily provoke our Polish neighbors. In the end, the whole matter was dropped. Mishnat, Pious, and of course, came to nothing. Final story here, again, Wisniewski. On Polish holidays, there was often a big deal, big celebrations in the school. And on this one occasion, I think it was Pilsudski's birthday, they were planning a big celebration with all sorts of features. And Norman, before he turned 14, according to him, had a wonderful voice. And to his great surprise, he was chosen by Wisniewski to deliver this Polish traditional song in front of this celebratory gathering. And you can imagine his surprise. And his parents were beside themselves. My God, Norman is chosen to sing on this occasion. And he rehearsed. And according to him, he knew this song backwards and forwards. It sounded great. His parents got him a new outfit. He rehearsed. He saw where he had to stand on the stage. And of course, he couldn't wait. He was a bit of a showman, I must concede. He couldn't wait to perform on this holiday. Well, the day arrived. He was waiting in the wings to be called. And at some point, of course, it is his turn. And as he prepares to go out onto the stage and sing his song, Wisniewski takes him by the hand and puts him behind the screen. And therefore, he never got to sing his song in front of the audience. Wisniewski felt it would simply be not right for a Jew to be up front and singing a Polish traditional song. Norman could sing, but he would not sing for everyone. He would sing behind the screen. So I think that gives you the flavor of relationships. Certain mutuality, certain acceptance, but you certainly knew the bottom line. And finally, going beyond Kolbashova to what is going on in Poland itself, let me just remind you, at that point, the population of Poland was about 30 million, and there were about 3 million Jews, about 10% of the population. And it was becoming quite clear that Poland, in its nationalistic fervor, in its anti-Semitic inclinations, was eager to do something about their Jewish problem. Cardinal Klon, the head of the Roman Catholic Church, had the following to say, quote, "We have in Poland 3.5 million Jews. In my estimation, 3 million too many." The Prime Minister, Skolnik, "I will not allow people to beat or kill Jews, but to destroy them economically, by all means." So clouds are gathering. There is a peasant co-op movement in the 1930s. And part of the movement is to establish their own co-ops and to cut the Jews out, particularly the Jews. Now remember, Jews were also living in the countryside as small merchants, sometimes as farmers, selling to the peasants. Well, this Polish peasant movement was intent on taking charge of their own economic affairs and inadvertently, in a sense, cutting out the Jewish middleman. And there were major rallies of these peasants in the marketplace. In fact, Norman mentions that some of the leaders actually met in his father's store to plan the activities. So the atmosphere, the future seemed rather grim. In fact, a law was passed sometime in the 30s that stated that Jews could no longer change their name. No longer could change their name to sound like a Polish name so that there'd be a certain level of acceptability, usually among the professional class, the lawyers, the doctors, the accountants, etc. So Norman said you would go to a place of business and see on a plaque that the first name had been erased, had been scratched out, because the law now denied Jews to be able to change their name to make it sound more Polish. So clearly, the circumstances in Poland were growing more fraught as the 1930s wear on, and as German Jews who have been kicked out of Germany head into Poland, and of course reinforce what many Jews were aware. I must say that Norman and his father spoke German, and therefore also were aware of what was happening in Germany. And then the final story here, as the Germans invade and as the Polish forces are forced back, they and refugees march through Kolbashova and loot all of the Jewish stores. And that marked the beginning of the end of the destruction of Jewish Kolbashova. So that's my story, or that's the story that I wanted to tell you via Norman. I hope you got some of the flavor of what Kolbashova life was all about. And I'm certainly eager and willing to respond to any thoughts or comments that might come my way.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Richard. That was
What a
wonderful.
story.
Thank you.
Yeah, I should tell you that Norman went on. He was captured by the Germans. He was forced to help in the destruction of the Jewish quarter of Kolbashova. I'm not sure I mentioned this last time, but he was an inveterate picture taker. So he took pictures throughout the 30s and into the early 40s, and he hid these pictures in the barns of peasants that he knew. And after the war, he came back and retrieved all of these pictures, which was a marvelous collection, which I think the Holocaust Museum has and YIVO has. And I should also tell you that he hid out, he fought in the woods. Most of the people with him were killed by peasants. He in turn killed many a peasant, some of whom helped him. One Catholic priest gave him bogus credentials, helped him survive. And I should mention that after the war, he sent packages, many packages back to Poland to those people who had helped him survive. And he invited some of them back to the United States, who stayed with him in Jersey for a period of time. who had enabled him to survive, the years from 1941 to 45. And he submitted the names to Yad Vashem as part of the program of righteous Gentiles. So he didn't forget, and he was very, very willing to support and reward and be grateful to those who had helped him get through those horrible years.
Can we get it? How do we get a copy of this book that you wrote?
Well, here, can I run it through the computer? Actually,
it's in our library at Central Synagogue-Beth.
Yes, it is.
Well, since we can't get it unless it's digital at this moment.
Actually, you can send
the library.
Amazon.
Yeah, I'll give you a phone number to call. It's a book distribution center. And if you want to get it, you call this number 800-848-6224. I recently sent for copies myself, and they are very prompt in responding. It's $19.95 for the book. Mention my name, it's $19.90, I think.
Okay. What's the exact title, Richard?
The title is A Jewish Boyhood in Poland. A Jewish Boyhood in Poland. His name is Norman Salzitz, Salsitz. My name you've probably heard before.
I think so.
Richard Skolnik, but I think Norman's name would be enough to identify the book if you want to go that route.
I have a question, Richard. You mentioned school a lot.
Yeah.
Did they also attend, and it seemed like they attended Polish school. When did they attend? I'm sure there was Jewish learning as well. When was that done?
They went to Cheder when they were 3 or 4 years old. They put honey on their lips the first day so as to make learning sweet.
Oh, yeah.
And then they had the Melamed. You saw that picture. Those who were here last week saw the picture of the Melamed with his charges. I don't know how they did it. And of course, 3-4-year-olds suddenly being taught the alphabet and Hebrew. In any event, they went to Cheder. Then when they were old enough, they went to Polish school, regular school, and then they went to Talmud Torah in the afternoon.
Okay.
So yeah, and then those, the learned ones went off to the big cities to really get a Jewish education. And then there were, as I mentioned last time, these numerous study groups.
Yes.
I mean, they took study seriously. You remember my saying, Tevye's dream was to study in the synagogue
And pray.
to be learned. I mean, that they took seriously.
Yes.
And that was a goal of theirs. Or as I said, I didn't mention it today, but mostly marriages took place at the same social level. Except for 2 instances. A very pretty poor girl could expect maybe to marry a well-to-do rich boy because of her beauty. They'd make exceptions. And then a scholar, a poor scholar, could also expect to marry the son of a well-to-do Jew in town because it was considered of the highest order to have a scholar in your household and to support him. I mean, a woman would be proud, supposedly, to labor in the store, and there were a number of stories about that, to labor in the store while her husband studied day after day. And that was a source of pride and status for the woman. So those were the major violations, shall we say, of marrying laterally along your class position. Normally that's what happened. And poor people who had no dowry, there was a dowry fund in town,
Right.
where they gave money to the poor women to enable them to find a husband, because they now had something of a dowry to offer in those circumstances. And very often matchmakers, it was like a scholarship. I will find you a match. You really don't have to pay me. I'm doing this as a mitzvah, so that there were certain concessions that matchmakers made, even for poor girls, because everyone had to get married. Everyone had to get married.
Mm. You know, my grandmother came from Poland. Well, my father was born in 1910, and she was here, obviously. But she came from a town called Borislav. And when I looked that up many years ago, I thought it was a little Shtetl like you're talking about. It was a town of 70,000. This was in 1870. And they had oil wells and spas. There's a whole section of Poland that has oil wells. So the idea of living, all the Poles living in a shtetl was obviously not true. And so I wonder what life was like, though, even in the big cities at the end of the 19th century. I mean, when you're talking about how unmodern it was in the 30s, what in the world was it like back then?
No, that's an excellent point. I'm giving you a slice of life from a particular milieu, and you're saying quite correctly, what about Warsaw? What about Breslau? What about some of the big cities? What was life like there? What did they have? And I have no answer to that, because Norman's story is a story of this particular kind of town. The only point I would make it was, I mean, look at Anatevka. It's a mythical town, but it was typical of, hundreds of other Jewish villages in Russia. And I would assume that Kolbashova was typical of hundreds of other, but it'd be interesting, of the 3.5 million Jews in Poland, what was the breakdown of urban and rural or village? And we may be surprised. And Jews often were a urban people. So I would expect you might be half and half, or maybe even tilting toward the cities.
Did any of these people that lived in these shtetl migrate to the cities, or did they spend their lives in these small towns?
Yeah, again, that's very thought. Most of them wanted to get out. There was really no future for at least half of the poor people there. They couldn't get out. And of course, they were supported by the community. So getting out was not a very promising prospect. But anyone who came from outside, even beyond America or Palestine, was considered someone special. It was such a cloistered existence that if you came from the outside, oh my God, you were worldly, you were cosmopolitan. So I would say, if given the opportunity, most of them would have probably wanted to leave. And as you saw with America and Palestine, I have no figures on this, but I would say the population in both those places probably equaled or exceeded from Kolbashova, probably equaled the number who remained. So it was a town in transition without much of a future, except for those who were relatively comfortable there, like Norman's father, and the doctors and the accountants and some of the businessmen who did well. But beyond that, it was a tenuous existence for most of them. But then again, Poland was a poor country. And as Norman says in one of the statements I read, it's no shame to be poor in a place where so many others are poor that you don't know those sharp distinctions.
Richard, I wanted to thank you. Both of my parents were immigrants. My mother came from Russia and lived a very similar life to what you described. My father, on the other hand, came from Warsaw, very, very wealthy. And he was what you described. His father was a scholar and married into this very wealthy family, spent all his days and nights studying. The father-in-law supported them forever. And it was that kind of a story. He was turned into a Hasidim. My father disliked him intensely, and his mother was not only rich, but very beautiful. And they had maids, and his sisters were tutored, which was very unusual for girls. And it was a totally different kind of existence. It's fascinating how different their worlds are. Yeah.
Talk about matches, one that I didn't, by and large, the story I gave you was standard, conventional.
Right.
Jews marrying Jews, but occasionally, rarely, something else happened. And this became the scandal of Kol B'Shova.
Right.
Miriam, a Jewish girl from a well-to-do family, had a tutor brought in by her parents to tutor her in various subjects, including learning Polish. And the tutor happened to be a Polish young man. And you can guess what happened.
Yes.
The two became romantically connected. She wanted to marry him. She did marry him. They ran off. He converted. This became the big scandal in town. And the mother, upon hearing this, went to the well and threw herself down and killed herself.
Wow.
That well, next to the synagogue, there were some auxiliary wells that I mentioned. That well would never be used again until the Germans occupied the town. But that was the main, if you went to Kol B'Shova in 1937 and said Miriam, you'd be scorned and shunned, and everyone knew. In fact, the family, as you might expect, that was left of it, had to move out of town. I mean, it was totally unacceptable. I mean, a double tragedy. But no surprise, I guess, given what we know about life and attitudes and traditions.
Well, even in Fiddler, you have one of the daughters.
It's the exact same thing, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there's a kind of an acceptance, a grudge acceptance at the end.
Because Steffi was that kind of a human being.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's part of the last scene, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. But Richard, how far was this town from a major city, or even a semi-major city?
Yeah, it was as Louise and I drove from Krakow. It was 2 hours east of Krakow over rather challenging roads.
Oh, from Krakow, okay.
Yeah, I mean, even then, you can imagine the roads in Kol B'Shova. When it rained, it turned into mud. The best season for getting around Kol B'Shova was winter, when all the wagons put on runners and they traversed on sleds. After that, it was, and keeping a house clean. I mean, you came in from mud or dust, and then you tracked it into the house. So that added to the burden of women who, try to keep the house reasonably clean, to have to deal with all the mud that was tracked in.
Richard, I'm sorry.
Richard,
I wanted to say, go ahead, Lois.
Just as an aside, my grandmother, as I say, was Polish, so that makes my children, I don't know, 1/4, 1/8, whatever. My younger daughter has blonde hair and green eyes, and she looks, quote, not Jewish, whatever. She has a business. She's a graphic artist, and she has a client in Poland. And 2 years ago, they make computer games, and she does the graphics. So she went to Poland, and I said to her, I'll bet they think you're Polish. And sure enough, she learned a few words of Polish from my daughter-in-law, whose mother is Polish. And sure enough, people started talking to her in Polish. And I said, look at the irony. Her great-grandmother was born in Poland, and they took her around for all the stuff. They didn't have time, but there is a memorial museum there in Warsaw. And I said, do these people know that this was the intellectual capital of Europe, Warsaw, way back in the day? But of course, the people of today, they're young, they don't have the same feeling of history of anti-Semitism, these people anyway, as their ancestors. But it was so interesting, and my daughter felt it. She says, I'm visiting an ancestral homeland. So that was very interesting.
I wanted to say, Richard, you described a different shtetl life than my mother's in that they didn't go, the men, to the public schools. They stayed in yeshivas. That was how they got their education. So I was very surprised to hear that.
Yeah, as I hinted just a few minutes ago, some of the more promising students went off to these illustrious yeshivas to be further indoctrinated into Judaism and the scriptures and the traditions. I read a passage last week that Norman's father would have liked nothing more for Norman to do that, but Norman had no such intention. Norman said that if singing was if Judaism was all about singing, he'd be the most devout Jew there ever was, because he loved to sing, and evidently he had quite a melodious voice. But since Judaism is a little more than singing, it would not be for him to go to a yeshiva.
But I was talking about the ordinary kids, not the ones that were the scholars. Yeah. They went to yeshivas. They did not go to public schools.
Yeah, he didn't get into that. There obviously was not one there.
Right.
But as I did mention last time, there were these itinerant rabbis who were always coming through.
Yeah.
Itinerant cantors. I mean, there was a real connection, a real network of serious Judaism, what he referred to as Magids, M-A-G-I-D-S, those who came and lectured to congregants after Saturday services. They would stay for 2 hours and listen. Remember, there were no sermons in the synagogue on Saturday. People didn't need sermons. They knew all that stuff, except when a specialist came and gave them an illustrious sermon by a dynastic rabbi who everyone respected from some other town in Poland.
Oh, thank you so much.
Okay, I was very happy to do it. We're just happy to get together. We're isolated. We're fragmented. Any opportunity to see all of you and to talk to you and to hear from you is welcome. And maybe we can do it again. I will try to come up with some other subjects. And if we do,
we would really welcome it, Richard. You are just so interesting, and we always learn so much.